Okay, I think we're up and running. Old man Winter can't keep us down, and we need to not let those parts of ourselves that tells us, here, let's put it this way: these haters can't hold us back. Haters not being people this time. It's those parts of ourselves inside us of us telling us okay to be lazy and sorry and to lay around because it's snow day. When we got stuff we got to do, especially since if we get behind it's going to hurt us for the AP test, and especially since, as great as all this stuff is, as much I like studying all this stuff, the stuff at the end, to me, is particularly relevant. So it's important to finish, and so we got to stay on pace. So you folks in the gold class, it's imperative that you take these notes, take them seriously, and we're looking at a test next week, and that's a test next week over several days worth of stuff, two of which you're getting via recording as opposed to live. And I'm a little skeptical of technology, but gonna make the best use of it as I can, and we'll work on that fifth period. Okay, so that's where we're at. So if you go back, here's where I am. So if I go back, so I think we looked at how women, so we're like at the reactions to the new immigrants when we were talking with each other last time. And maybe I'll just start right here. There was some nativism to those, to the new immigrants. Remember, the nativists formed something called the Know Nothing Party when it was the old immigrants, the Irish and the Germans, but these are the new immigrants who become the majority really in 1890. And so the natives formed something called the American Protective Association. And so the nativism against the new immigrants, the J groups, Jews, Greeks, Russian, Italians, Polish Slavs, were for several reasons. Always taking jobs as a problem. These immigrants would work as scabs sometimes. Those are replacement workers if there's a strike. The religion was different, either Judaism or Orthodox Christianity, which is definitely not Baptist, Methodist, Tent Revival, Second Great Awakening Christianity. Pretty different, even if in its style, if not in content. The radical politics, they could be socialists or anarchists, feeling like, the big business in their country, the elite in their country was in charge of everything. So either the government ought to take over everything to make things fair, the way farmers wanted the populace to take over the railroads. Farmers wanted the government to take over the railroads, or just hate on all government, destroy all government if you're ever going to have justice. So, in some ways, a socialist and an anarchist are opposites of each other, but they're coming from the same concern that the elites control everything and the common people don't get a chance. All right, they're different ethnically. They were seen as racially different. Take a look at the similarity between the word slave and Slav. We get our word slave from the word Slavs when we first start calling Africans slaves, at our colonial back in 1619. So folks in Central Europe were associated racially with Africans. And so, these folks were not considered white at the time. It's been kind of a evolutionary process. All right, we got the Statue of Liberty in 1886. It was a gift from France. I looked it up in another class in honor of Abraham Lincoln. So, he's the guy who gave liberty to the slaves. So the French were honoring Abraham Lincoln. At the base of it is that poem right there, very pro-immigrant poem. And it's called the New Colossus, and the argument of the New Colossus is, we're this new powerful country as opposed to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And what made them big and powerful was a big, strong military. And what made us big and powerful was our moral greatness and our willingness to take in anybody. You give us the ones that you don't want, the outcasts. We'll take them and make some out of them. We'll turn into a dang American. And they'll be able to make their descendants will achieve things that's going to make their ancestors proud. All right, so very inspirational, very relevant to today's immigration debates. And so there's the Statue of Liberty there. Emerald Lazarus was Jewish, the child of immigrants. All right. Okay, let's look at this for a second. Don't worry about any song. But the first one, let's imagine you're in a bad situation. Do you try to make the best of it or you change it? You're in a bad relationship. Do you hang in there or do you get out of it? Things are not going well on an athletic team, in drama, in some extracurricular activity, some passion of yours or your pursuit of yours. And you've got that decision to make. Are you going to hang in there and make the best of it or are you busting out? You quitting? So think about that for a second to motivate our next discussion right here. Second slide. It's going to be the second slide. All right, this is all out of that urbanization chapter. Okay, so we're looking at urbanization, kind of American thought during the time of urbanization. There's something called Christian Science, founded by Mary Baker Eddy. That's not Scientology like Tom Cruise and like Hollywood, that sort of thing. But this lady argued that faith, religious faith, not only makes people happier. There's studies that show people of faith, have a little higher life satisfaction, but also makes you healthier. There's a newspaper still around today called the Christian Science Monitor coming out of that. All right. Darwin's theory of evolution was very, very influential on everyone's mind at the time. We've looked at social Darwinism, the application of it to economics and whether or not the industrialists should be making all the money. But accommodationists, most Americans were Christians at the time, and so Christians had to decide if Darwin's theory contradicted evolution or contradicted Christianity, or whether or not they could accommodate this theory of natural selection in animals to their own Christian faith. And so accommodationists were folks living in the cities who were okay with the teachings of science but also continued to be Christians. Public schools drastically increasing, especially public high schools. Remember, what was it? 1% of Italians who came to the United States were literate, and so public high schools was a big movement across the country. And then public health is improving. We got all these people living together and they're getting sick. So Lister and Pasteur, we talked about Lister, was the guy who came up with the idea that Dr. Bliss made fun of, that, you ought to wash your hands before, a doctor ought to wash their hands before doing surgery. And then Pasteur, it comes up with a process of pasteurization for cleaning out milk. See that right there? So there's Lister. That's Lister. All right, and that is a Pasteur. Okay, here's our back to our question. And so the question is, if things ain't going good, do you hang in there with it, or do you try to tear the thing up, bust out, quit, however you want to put it? So you had this debate in the South. So we're going back down to the South, 1880s maybe, let's say. So Reconstruction has ended, Compromise of 1877, but it's kind of it's a period of Southern transition in race relations. You hadn't quite gotten to the full-on segregation of Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, and the Jim Crow laws. But the South is becoming increasingly segregated over time. African Americans seem to be losing the political power they had held during Reconstruction. The Redeemer governments are in charge of the South. These Redeemers are also called Bourbon. The Bourbon governments, that's a European phrase for kind of real conservative governments that took over in Europe after Napoleon fell, after the French Revolution. And so African American intellectuals start to have a debate. What do you do about segregation? And so you have this fella, Booker T. Washington. And so what we're going to do is we're going to assume that everybody said segregation is bad and you got to fight against it. That's not Washington's position. His position was the opportunities available for African Americans in the South as political rights kind of seem to fade away would be economic. So the thing to do is make the best of those economic opportunities. So he's a founder of a college in Tuskegee, Alabama. It's a trade school, kind of like Georgia Northwest up here right beside us. And he's going to train people at his college, African Americans at his college, to be farmers, not to be teachers and doctors and lawyers, but to be farmers and factory workers and maids. So, kind of blue collar work. Teach them a skill. If today it'd be like a plumber or an electrician or something like that. It's a trade school, and his argument is this is the best that African Americans can hope for in the South at that time, in that context. And kind of similar to the immigrant story. The immigrant story is not necessarily the case that the immigrant that arrives in the United States is going to have a great life. But if that immigrant gets a job and works hard and takes care of his or her family, well, then the kids can enjoy all the blessings of liberty and enjoy the full-fledged benefits of the American life. And so Washington's saying the same thing, that African Americans need to not be sharecroppers and tenant farmers anymore, right? They need to be independent farmers. And that was what, the idea behind 40 acres and a mule was. So it'd be a 2-generation process, maybe even a 3-generation process. But African Americans right then needed skills that would make them economically independent. Then, later, they could start talking about civil rights. All right, that opened him up to a lot of criticism, really by historians looking back at him. A lot of African-American historians don't like him. My son Zach at Georgia took an African-American studies class, and the professor there hated Booker T. Washington and thought of him as an Uncle Tom. And there were people at the time, other African Americans at the time, that thought of him as an Uncle Tom as well. A sellout, somebody just, white people's favorite black man, something like that. And W.E.B. Du Bois was the leader of this. He's going to be the founder of the NAACPs, the interest group still around today. It's going to be the group that pushes Brown versus Board of Education, that court case that integrates the school, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And he argued that the talented tenth of African Americans ought to be able to get any job, the top 10% of African American students ought to be able to get any job that whites can get, be doctors, lawyers, teachers, PhDs. W.E.B. Du Bois was the first Harvard PhD. And so, and he was a big critic of Washington. So these two had this kind of debate about was it okay for African Americans just worry about economics, or should they fight for full civil rights? The NAACP came out of something called the Niagara Movement, a group of civil rights leaders stayed at Niagara Falls, but they had to stay on the Canadian side of the border. Because the hotels on the American side wouldn't let them stay there. So, they wanted full civil rights. And so their commitments, kind of very similar to Martin Luther King's commitments. Ida B. Wells was also an African-American leader of the time. And she was from the South, ended up moving to the North, but she was a writer, and she wrote about the lynching that was going on in the South in the 1880s, 1890s, at the end of Reconstruction, during the Jim Crow era. Once the Jim Crow era really kicks in, and the lynching kind of gets the word. I think the two decades in which the lynching is the worst is the 1890s and the 1900s, I guess you call them, the first 10 years of the first decade of the 20th century. So she started studying cases in which African-American men had been lynched, and she found, and she argued in her newspapers, that almost all of these cases were a To Kill a Mockingbird kind of situation, if you know the To Kill a Mockingbird story. It would involve an interracial relationship between a white woman and a black man, and then they get found out. And so then the white woman, especially the young white woman, teenage white girl, to save her reputation, to keep her dad from beating her up, would then accuse the guy of rape. At which point, the guy kind of had a choice. He could confess, in which case he'd be hung, and the execution would be fairly slow and painless. Or he could continue to he could swear up and down that there hadn't been a rape, in which case the execution would be slow and just ungodly. And so she wrote about that, and she lived in Nashville. She had a friend who was lynched. And she became increasingly unpopular among whites in the South, so she had to move to the North, and she became part of the NAACP. So she's not as well known, but you can rhyme the names to help you with her. You got Booker T and W.E.B. You also got Ida B. W.E.B. So it's really Booker T versus W.E.B. and Ida B. In this debate about whether or not African Americans ought to fight for political rights. All right. That's a pretty big topic. We almost don't do anything Southern in the 1880s, 1890s here. But this is kind of what's going on. This is the meanwhile back in the South, part of that, part of the Gilded Age unit. Okay, I'm not going to say too much about this one. Hit it quickly. All right, there were a number of black colleges that were created during this period of time. So, and the philanthropists, Carnegie and Rockefeller would give money for those, especially the kind of Atlanta University Center in Atlanta. So Howard, Morehouse, Atlanta University. There's 4 or 5 historically black colleges in Atlanta, and then there's other ones throughout the South, and they start to be created during this time all over the South. All right, the Hatch Act extends something called the Morrill Act. And it sets up agricultural colleges. A lot of the pretty well-known universities today: Ohio State, Cal, Texas A&M. Texas A&M stands for Texas Agricultural and Machinery. Agriculture and machinery were these agricultural colleges set up by the government, to help. You got all these farmers moving out west because of the Homestead Act, and so you needed advanced. If you're going to grow crops on the plains, you need advanced agricultural techniques. Also, the philanthropists were given money for other colleges. So Chicago was funded. University of Chicago was funded by Rockefeller. Stanford's named after Leland Stanford's son right there. All right, I'm going to hush for a second. Take a break. Let you match it up. All right. Let's see. All right. I won't really worry about the yellow journalism. I'm just going to talk about that first one. We'll hit yellow journalism in the, we're going to hit that in the imperialism chapter. It's going to be a big cause of the Spanish-American War. Pragmatism is a pretty good thing to know about. It's a very American philosophy, and the idea is you've got a lot of smart guys with great theories about, about what's true and how the world works. And so the American approach to that would be pragmatic. And if you think a guy's got a good idea, well, you evaluate the truth of the idea by its consequences. So the people that are involved in that, William James is kind of the founder of pragmatism. Oliver Wendell Holmes is going to be on the Supreme Court. John Dewey's an educator, one of leaders of public education in our history. A lot of times, let's go with this one. Let's go with Bernie Sanders. All right, I bring up Bernie Sanders and people kind of roll their eyes or fuss at each other about it. Bernie Sanders says inequality is a bad thing and that the government ought to fight inequality, and he's right. Inequality is bad. It's bad to be a snob. It's bad for somebody to make $1 billion a year and somebody else to make $15,000 a year. That kind of inequality is not good for the country. It wasn't good in the Gilded Age. It's not good today. But then the question is, what kind of plan do you have to fix that problem? And there's where theories like socialism, that the government ought to just take over everything, runs into the problem of, let's try that idea out and see how it works. If the idea doesn't work, well, then it may not be a great idea. So if you look at 2 theories, during the Gilded Age, laissez-faire, the government ought to leave business alone. and socialism. The government ought to take over everything. Both of them make sense. They're both logical, and you find a smart person to tell you about why they believe in those theories. They're persuasive, but then you try them out, they don't necessarily work very well. Problems come along. The problem of laissez-faire, you've seen the inequality in the way the worker gets treated. Problem of socialism ends up being the kind of communism we get in, the Soviet Union when we study the Cold War, and the loss of freedom. So, although both of these ideas are idealistic, make good logical sense, not very pragmatic. So, pragmatism is a very American school of thought. Okay, here's books. Books being written during the Gilded Age. What to say about them? A recurring thing. Twain, first off, comes up with this theory of, this phrase, the Gilded Age. But Red Badge of Courage, Call of the Wild, and really Sister Carrie, the thesis is almost, oh gracious, survival of the fittest is troubling. Call of the Wild is very much about the fittest Alaskan sleigh dog, but it's survival of the fittest. Sister Carrie is about this poor young lady that comes to the city, moved to the city, and she wants to, she wants the advantages of urban life, especially, the shopping and the nice clothes and so forth. And, she ends up, she ends up dying. So she can't quite make it. Red Badge of Courage, about some guy's not strong enough to be able to fight in the Civil War. So you've got that, you've got the theme of survival of the fittest and what do you do about that throughout. Huck Finn, is about slavery. And Emily Dickinson is writing at this time, and her claim to fame is she didn't publish anything. Not sure if there's anything particularly Gilded Ages about that, but we found out about her poems after she died. Okay, what else will we say? All these ladies are moving to the cities. They're fighting for the right to vote. Prior to the 19th Amendment, which was passed in 1920, most of the western states had given women the right to vote. If a woman could make it in the rough and tumble of the West, she kind of received the respect that maybe she wouldn't get in more conservative areas of the country. Ladies become more economically independent, so they quit having as many kids, and they're more likely to want a divorce. And so the divorce rate starts going up for the first time. Also, you have an interest group called the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and it's kind of continuing that effort to fight for temperance, for guys not drinking too much because it ruins, their family life. And the founder of it is a lady by the name of Frances Willard. The most fun lady is this lady by the name of Carrie Nation. And you take a look at her, she's about 6'2". She's a big lady, and she's very religious, and she do these things called hatchetations. She'd go into a saloon and she'd pray over the saloon for a minute, and the saloon was, like an all-male thing. And then she'd chop the place up. And the men would just be standing there. They were all scared of her. So she's kind of fun to learn about. And the saloon's kind of fun to learn about, So that's the WCTU, These efforts to get suffrage and to get rid of drinking are going to bear fruit right after World War I. All right, so there it is. Let's go back. Yep. All right, and that gets us out of that chapter. Okay, we've got all the Indian stuff that we did, so I think everybody's okay on the Indian stuff. But then we also got cowboys. We got to do cowboys and farmers. All right, so cowboys lived, and hey, everybody, sing with me now. All right, and your heart will be warmed, and you'll also be troubled that I carry on about Texas and I don't know all the words. But let's go ahead and sing for a moment, shall we? The eyes of Texas are upon you all the live long day. The eyes of Texas are upon you. I think it goes, you cannot turn away. Something, 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 something. Do not think you can escape them. Let's go with that. Rising up so early in the morn, the eyes of Texas are upon you. Till Gabriel blows his horn. And the Texas football team sings that at the end of every game. And there you see the great big Texas sky. Look how freaking big that sky is. So when you're in the great state of Texas, you know, the American dream just opens up to you because you got none of these dabbling pine trees closing off the possibilities of your life and dreams. All right, so there you get the little Texas context here, which is why Texas is the greatest state in the country. Cowboys came from Texas, and they made up a number of different groups. They were veterans of the Civil War, both Union and Confederates, although, you know, this is a Southern thing, so more Confederate veterans. African Americans don't want to be sharecroppers, tenant farmers. Mexicans, Texas had been a state in Mexico. Just look at that dang sky right there. Ain't that thing beautiful? And also some Indians. And their job during a 20-year period, the cowboy era, is a specific time and a specific place in American history. The place is Texas, and the time is the 20 years after the Civil War. So it's from 1865 to 1885. And these Texans, these cowboys, are going to take Longhorns. And Longhorns are special too. Longhorns were like the bovine Mustang, a cow Mustang. And they'd been roaming Texas, Mexico for, you know, hundreds of years since the Spanish brought cattle over, and of course, you know, the Latin American countries set up cowboys is kind of Texan, is kind of Mexican, and so chaps and lassos and cowboy hats had already been developed in Latin America by Latin American cowboys who tamed cattle and had ranches. But in Texas, you know, these cattle had kind of wandered their way up over the years the same way Mustangs had. And they just kind of roamed the range on their own. And, you know, you could kill a cow and make a steak. They didn't make the best steaks because they were in like good physical shape. They were muscular. They were the toughest of all cattle. And so there wasn't enough fat to make a great steak. But you couldn't sell them anywhere because there weren't any railroads in Texas. So what happens are the cowboys get together and they have what's called rounding. So they'll brand cattle. So they're establishing property rights to the cattle, and then the cattle will roam the range until it's time for a roundup. In which case, you, the cowboy, gets all your cattle together, and you take them up to Kansas with other cowboys on what's called a cattle drive or a long drive. And the reason you're going to Kansas is because there's railroads in Kansas that go to New York City and Philadelphia and Boston, cities where people want to buy hamburgers and steaks. So that's the very brief story of Cowboys and Longhorns. And, you know, the football teams we associate with Texas are the Texas Longhorns and the Dallas Cowboys. Okay. Now, it only doesn't last very long. It's just a 20-year period. And the cowboy era is, but, you know, kind of like this frontier thesis, you know, tells us a lot about our identity, the sense of self-reliance and toughness that we like to associate ourselves with. But they ended because barbed wire. Now, barbed wire helped cowboys because they could keep their cows in one place. But then once you can build barbed wire fences, you can ranch in your cattle. And over time, it became harder and harder to get the cattle from one place to the next because of all the fencing. Additionally, once railroads come to Texas, so we put railroads as like a fourth thing, the cowboy life extends kind of to the northwest, you know, all the way up to like Montana and Wyoming. The cows eat all the grass on the way, and, you know, they're like competing with you kind of get environmental damage going in the plains. The buffalo and the cattle and then sheep are all eating up all the grass. So the grass kind of becomes endangered to an extent and harder to get the cattle over a long distance because you hit, you know, dry areas where they can't eat. Then you have some really bad weather for a couple of years there. I think I've got 1885, 86. It may be 86 to 87, I think narrative history says. And then it's followed by 10 years of drought. So that was the weather did them in. All right. After the cowboy period, cattle production shifted to large ranches by the 1890s certainly. There's trains that are going into western areas, and so you can put your cattle on train. You've also got the invention of the refrigerated car by a guy named Augustus Swift. So the original Longhorns got put on trains in what the cattle towns, most famous two cattle towns were Abilene and Dodge City. Dodge City because you better duck because there's always shootouts going on. This is the wild, wild west again. Um, but by the time the cattle would make it to New York City, they were half dead and starved, and there wasn't anything good to eat. So you do the slaughtering in before you put them on the trains, and then the refrigerated cars prevents the cattle from spoiling. The beef from spoiling. On the way to the East Coast. All right. You also got folks moving west. Let me see if I got. Yep. Okay. Hey, copy that down just for a second. Let me close this door. I think I'm bothering somebody. All right. So you got cows. So we've done Indians, and now we got cowboys, and now we got farmers. And the farmers get saved for last in these chapters. But they're important. You get AP questions on these farmers here. It's kind of the end of the farming life, the beginning of the end. But the first thing that happens is you get more farmers. So during the Civil War in 1862, Congress passed the Republican Congress under President Abraham Lincoln passed 3 laws of tariff. So we know about that. It's Republicans. But also what was it called? It's called the Pacific Railway Act. So, funded the Transcontinental Railroad. And then also the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act gave away a lot of land to farmers. So, farmers have been given 160 acres good bit before Indians had with the Dawes Act. And so that Dawes Act is in some ways kind of based on the Homestead Act. But the government give these folks land, 160 acres of land, if they promise to farm for 5 years. Now, a lot of the folks who took them up on the offer were like land speculators, and so they would turn around and sell the land for a profit. So it wasn't always folks getting free land that moves out there. But they get 2 names. They're called homesteaders. They're also called sod busters. And so your homestead would be, your farm. They're called sod busters because there ain't any trees out there. So if you're going to have a house, it's made out of dirt. So dirt and like grass. So there's a couple of pictures of sod homes. And so you get some cute names coming out of that. If you're going to make your house out of dirt anyway, you might as well dig your floor down deep so that you don't have to build the house up too high. So a floor that was maybe a couple of feet below ground level was called a dugout. So we get that baseball term from those sod houses, the dugout. And also the trains that are carrying a lot of goods to the farmers or a lot of stuff from the farmers back east that are heavy trains would need 2 engines. So that train was called a double header. So we get a couple of baseball terms from that. So if you're going to get the land, you got to promise it's free or cheap, but you got to promise to farm it for 5 years. And so you've got these agricultural colleges that we talked about. So you come up with dry farming techniques involving kind of digging down deep and turning up the dirt, the moister dirt that you can grow things over time. That's gonna these farmers gonna pay a price for that with the Dust Bowl. But originally the dry farming allowed farmers to grow corn and wheat. And so what happens is, this is why you had the Plains Indian Wars, because settlers are moving out to the plains to become farmers in areas that was previously thought too arid. All right, so you got a bunch of western states. You see all your western states here. I will point out that a couple of states that are kind of late. They're all kind of late. But let's go with Utah. Utah had been around for a while. Remember, the Mormons came out to Utah in the age of Jackson, but they weren't allowed to form the state of Utah until they put it in their constitution that polygamy was going to be illegal. So the Mormons, the Mormon Church of Utah became the Church of Latter-day Saints, the LDS, which is our contemporary Mormon church. And, so today's adherents of the Church of Latter-day Saints are not polygamous. Mitt Romney, most famously, ran for president against President Obama in what year? 2012. All right, also you've got Oklahoma. When Oklahoma's playing Texas, you always want to root for the Texas Longhorns over the Oklahoma Sooners. Yeah, we're glad we beat the Oklahoma Sooners. Georgia beat them because the Sooners are cheaters. To be a Sooner is to be a cheater. So, we'll go ahead and take that's not a very good map. I need to fix that. But there's Oklahoma right there. It becomes state in 1907. So what happened was the government decided to take away some of that Indian land from like the Cherokee, and they're going to have a race to stake out your claim for good farmland in Oklahoma. So there's a specific day that it was supposed to happen. Well, they fire the gun, and everybody goes galloping out there to stake their claim, and they find that a bunch of people had already staked their claim. They had cheated. So you call somebody who cheats in this land contest a Sooner. They staked their claim sooner than they were supposed to. So that's kind of the history of Oklahoma. So you don't want to root for no dang team whose name means cheater. What kind of name is that? Okay. All right. So the Texas Longhorns, and I say, why would I hate on the Oklahoma Sooners after they lost to Georgia? But the Texas Longhorns, big rivals are the Oklahoma Sooners since they're right next to each other like Georgia and Alabama. All right, I'm going to hush, let you go over that. Okay. Apologize for the funky Roman numerals. But I don't think I'm going to fix them, so you put whatever number you want to. So we're back to the farmers. So you got the Homestead Act, so these guys move out here. So this is what I would do. I may think about this and change this, but for the time being, what I would do is memorize 4 or 5 of these. My experience from past years is nobody gets more than 4 and 5 of them learned. Now, it might be that we change that. You can like group them together. So when we get back to class, maybe 5th period, we might talk about that. So you can do like what? Interest rates and freight rates, those go together, and property taxes. So that's kind of the way either local governments or railroads are screwing the farmers, at least the farmers feel like. So maybe those 3 should go together. The shipping rates, the interest rates, and the property taxes. And then, the natural problems, boll weevil, especially in the South, droughts and floods. And then you'd kind of be looking at economics here. And you might even put deflation with property taxes because that's kind of governmental policy, dang it. All right. But these were the problems. If you're just growing one crop, if the price of that crop goes down because maybe you grow too much of it, or worldwide farmers grow too much of it. They grow a lot of wheat in Russia. Well, then the price of that crop goes down, and so you lose money no matter how hard you're working. So a big frustration of the farmers were, they felt like if they worked hard enough, they're supposed to be able to take care of their families out there. But it would seem like the harder they worked, the further behind they get. And you see that really the centennial, 1876, is really the year farmers go below 50%. And by 1900, they're going down below 40%. Second thing, the world market, because we're not the only, they're having to sell their goods to like Europe. And so they're having to compete with Russia, compete with Egypt, compete with European farmers. And so, the world market affects prices. And so, again, you could work real hard and, grow a lot, be a good farmer and grow a lot of stuff, and yet you don't make any money off of it. All right, the third problem is deflation. Deflation is bad for people who are in debt. Inflation is good for people who are in debt. If you if prices go up and you borrowed something, you have to actually pay back less than you borrowed. If you have 100% inflation on a tractor that you borrowed or a plow that you borrowed, 3 or 4 years later after you borrow the plow, you only owe half a plow back, half of a tractor. Interest rates, high interest rates would make it hard to pay off your debt when you borrow money for your land or your tools. Those natural problems made it hard to, maybe the price of the crop's going to be good, but then, you have a bad crop because of the bugs or the weather. Local governments passing high property taxes, and then the railroads charging an arm and leg to ship your goods to the east. So they're running up into a lot of things where they feel like it's not just up to them. The American ideal is if it's to be, it's up to me. If I work hard enough. If you work hard enough, you're going to make a good grade in my class, you're going to make a good AP score, is the faith. But their faith is constantly under assault because of all these challenges here. All right, so what do they do about it? Well, they're going to work to fill in the gap. Our three organizations are going to spell out gap: Grange, Alliance, and Populace. So Oliver Kelly was the leader of the Grange, and the Grange would be people living out in the middle of nowhere that would get together and kind of talk to each other about their problems. They were lonely. You live out in the middle of nowhere. There's no trees. There's nothing but dirt and wind out there. We get lonely and you want to talk to people who have things in common with you. So farmers would get together and talk, but then they find out that they were having similar problems. So they formed the Alliance. Later, farmers formed this group called the Alliance, and they would form cooperative stores where they could kind of pool their resources to buy the equipment rather than going in debt, or they would store their crops in warehouses, wait for the price to go up, and the Alliance would run political candidates who would have local political success in Kansas and Nebraska and places like that. All right, then you've got the Populist Party that we talked about, I think, before Christmas. And you had this lady, Mary Elise, famous for saying, farmers need to raise less corn and more hay. They need to get involved in politics because it's not fair, the problems that farm. It's rigged. The whole thing's rigged against them, they feel like. It's a fix, to quote a song sung in the play the other night. And so, they want to fix that. All right, there's the populist proposals. I believe that we got those down last time, so I'm not going to talk about them again. All right, and the populists kind of come along. They kind of wax and wane based on the economy. So the first time we talked about fired up farmers was after the Panic of 1873. So now you got the Panic of 1893. Panic of 1893, the depression was so bad you had the first march on Washington. It wasn't by African Americans, it was by unemployed folks, and they wanted the government to give them jobs, public works jobs, and we're going to see that. The government's going to do that during the Great Depression. It was called Jacob Coxey is the guy who led it, but it didn't work out. They got to the Capitol and they got arrested for trespassing, for walking on the Capitol lawn. So, they got nothing out of it, but, they're marching on Washington. All right, also the Pullman strike where you learned about Eugene Debs came along. And so it's this bad economy that are frustrating the farmers just the way they're frustrating the workers. Okay, so I'm going to let you work on that. I'm going to hush. Then I believe I've got one more, and, we may be getting close to 40 minutes here. If we go over 40 minutes, the video doesn't make right. It gets a lot harder, so I'm going this one more. All right, here we go. So last heading here is going to be the election of 1896. And so it's kind of the farmer's last stand. So the Republicans are nominating William McKinley. He's just kind of a standard Gilded Age kind of Republican politician, Garfield Arthur Harrison kind of guy. He was in favor of the tariff. While he was in Congress, there had been a high tariff passed called the McKinley tariff. He was in favor of the gold standard. That keeps prices low. That's good for lenders, creditors. It's bad for indebted farmers. So very pro-business economic stance. So Western Republicans quit the Republican Party because of his political positions. The Democrats nominated this guy who had big-time populist leaning. The populists were, a third political party, kind of the farmers' political party. William Jennings Bryan is the guy. And he gives this speech called the Cross of Gold speech. And So he is running for our president. He gets nominated by the Democrats. He's only 36 years old. You got to be 35 to run, so barely old enough to run. If he'd been elected, he would have been the youngest president ever by a good little bit. And so there's the line from it. So he's trying to stand up during this period of time, bad economy, stand up for the workers and the farmers. So, and he's a very religious guy, tent revival kind of campaign. I believe he was Presbyterian. I don't think he was Baptist or Methodist, but he's got that revival preacher kind of style. So famous line is one of the top 5 American history speeches ever. Shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. In other words, the common man is being crucified by Gilded Age economics, by the big business and, the politicians who are in the pocket of big business. So he's going to be the guy, he's going to be the radical, and he's seen as this radical, who's the first politician really standing up to the powers that be here. And he's got a chance to win. So there he is. Now, let's take note. Take note. Do you think the artist likes, is this a pro or an anti-Brian political cartoon? Okay, we might talk about that. All right. And so then, the populace, this Farmers Party has to decide whether or not they're going to join, they're going to let the Democrats take them all over. So if they want to be populist, they can do all these things that the populists want to do. All that stuff right there. But they're going to lose. Third parties always lose elections in American history. So they can be pure and stand up for the farmers and do all the fight for all the farmers want, but then they're going to lose. Or do they compromise with the Democratic Party in order to elect a president who is much more pro-farmer, pro-common man than the Republican presidents or even the Democrat Grover Cleveland who had been president? So the populists decided to support Bryan, and his one issue is that he wants the government to coin free and unlimited silver at a 16-to-1 ratio. You'll see this sometimes. 16 times. Every coin will have 16 times as much silver as gold. And the idea is just to inflate the currency. More money equals higher prices, which equals good times for underprivileged, indebted farmers. So he's fighting for these guys, and he's fighting. And you see that in the campaign, he fought. He traveled 18,000 miles, so he's kind of like the first modern campaign where the presidential candidate goes all over the country making speeches. Gave 600 speeches to 5 million listeners. McKinley, on the other hand, stayed at his home, and reporters would come to his home every now and then. He would step outside and take a few questions. But he had a whole lot more money than Bryan did. So much better for, the Gilded Age guys. The industrialists made lots of unlimited donations to the Republican campaign. All right. So, McKinley wins. Popular vote, 53 to 47, so kind of close. Electoral vote, not all that close. Hey, let's fix this. That looks ridiculous. Bryan won. I don't know why I had the word wound there. Bryan won the South and the West. Obviously, all the place that the farmers live. He didn't win. He had 2 groups of people he needed to win. He needed these urban workers on his side. The factory workers. Now, the factory workers' interests are not the industrialist interests, but there were a lot of reports that, the factory owners, the bosses would tell the workers, if Bryan wins, we're going out of business, you're not going to have a job. So, the workers were kind of scared into voting Republican, voting for McKinley. And then also northern farmers here. Wheat farmers, but folks who are maybe Lutheran, whose religion, or Catholic, whose religious practices are a lot less fired up and, tent revival-y than Bryan, was kind of put off by his sermonizing tactics. They didn't like his political style, even if they kind of liked his political positions. And for that reason, he lost these northern agricultural states. These are not really urban states, but the farmers here didn't like him very well. So if he had won those states, he would have had a better shot. So he lost. Now, the economy got better. Crop prices rose, so farmers, had better times after that. So that's kind of the end of the populace. You don't need to inflate the currency. You get a lot more gold discovered, so you got more money. That's going to be more inflation. So the farmers were doing better, and so as a result, that was kind of the end of the populace and the end of any political party making their stand on behalf of farmers in particular. The other story about this is the book Wizard of Oz is about this election. The wizard is McKinley. If you know the story of the Wizard of Oz, the wizard himself is not nearly as impressive as when you get up close to him as from a distance, where he's this big and imposing fella. Brian is the lion who roars, so that's like his speech making. I don't know why he doesn't have any courage. I don't think anybody argued that Brian didn't have any courage. The Tin Man is the factory worker who doesn't have the heart to vote for Brian and the Democrats. The Scarecrow is the farmer, and he doesn't have a brain, remember? And so he can't understand what's happening to him. No matter how hard he works, his price as far as crops go down, and he can't get ahead. Harder works, farther behind he is, so he doesn't understand it. So, the author's not making the case that the farmers are stupid. It's that they just don't understand their economic plight, because most of us are not economists. Dorothy is the American voter. And in the book, she doesn't have ruby slippers. She's got silver slippers. And the yellow brick road is the Republican position. Follow the yellow brick road. And Wizard of Oz, OZ stands for ounces, like in gold, in ounces of gold. And the silver slippers is, you want to wear silver rather than just gold. All right, what about the witches? I don't know. I can't remember exactly what the witches are supposed to be. I can't carry it out exactly. And there's some controversy. I think the author later got interviewed, and he said, "Oh no, I was just writing a story." So maybe not, but there are an awful lot of coincidences. Okay, there you go. All right, and I'm going to shut this thing down. So hopefully we will come in under 40 minutes.